deceit, conspiracy, treachery, all fitting words for what was happening behind the scenes in the Catholic Church as the issue of contraception overwhelmed the Church 50 years ago. Welcome to Catholic Investigative Agency and the Contraception Deception. It seems like some people, organizations, and governments are hell-bent on bringing down the Catholic Church. The question is, how do you expose opposition to the faith and to the truth? And while they say what you don't know can't hurt you, everybody needs to know about the hidden forces prowling around the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Guess that's where we come in. Follow me. Hello, I'm Michael Voris. This is the Catholic Investigative Agency, CIA. What would you say if you were to hear that Western civilization is living a lie? And it isn't a small lie. It is, in fact, a lie that is literally killing us. It's the lie that contraception is good, that it's good for couples, good for public policy, good government, good for nations, and good for humanity. In the last 100 years, the world has gone from a near total rejection to a near total embrace of contraception and birth control. Throughout this program, we will be showing why contraception is not good for couples or policy or for nations or for humanity. In fact, that it is evil. But first, our thesis statement. Modern man has divorced sex from procreation through his embrace of contraception. This contraception deception within the Catholic Church has come about by a near total betrayal of the faithful by their shepherds and leaders. So, in order to find our way back, we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here?
Love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage. This I tell you, brother, you can't have one without the other.
Accepting the lie of contraception, that sex is consequence-free and for pleasure alone, divorces marriage and raising a family from sex. The deception, as old as mankind itself, is first noted through accounts in biblical times. In the New Testament, St. Paul, in his letter to St. Timothy, reminds the early Christians of the obligation of accepting children and the vocation of parenthood. She will be saved through childbearing if she continue in faith and love and sanctification with sobriety. The teaching of the apostles is continued with the church fathers, starting with Lactantius. He was a 3rd century philosopher who defended the faith and was an advisor to the Emperor Constantine. In his work entitled Divine Institutes, Lactantius says,
"Some complain of the scantiness of their means, and allege that they have not enough for bringing up more children. Wherefore, if anyone, on any account of poverty, shall be unable to bring up children, it is better to abstain from relations with his wife."
And later, St. Thomas Aquinas picks up the thread with some advice for future married couples, saying,
"Nor, in fact, should it be considered a slight sin for a man to arrange for the emission of semen apart from the proper purpose of begetting and bringing up children. The inordinate emission of semen is incompatible with the natural good of preserving the species. Hence, after the sin of homicide whereby a human life already in existence is destroyed, this type of sin appears to take next place, for by it the generation of human nature is impeded."
The Church, in her expression of God's revelation through Scripture and tradition, speaks through her popes and identifies the contemporary problem, which in reality has been present for over 100 years. Pope Leo XIII reaffirmed the Church's teaching on marriage, family, and contraception. In 1880, he wrote the encyclical Arcanum Divinae Sapientia, in which he wrote,
"For, first, there has been vouchsafed to the marriage union a higher and nobler purpose than was ever previously given to it. By the command of Christ, it not only looks to the propagation of the human race, but to the bringing forth of children for the Church."
Despite the Pope's admonition to safeguard marriage, over the next 50 years, people became so confirmed in the use of contraception that, as the Pope warned, not only did sex become severed from procreation, but marriage as well. As modern man grew more materialistic and self-centered, placing less emphasis on children, the question of limiting the size of families erupted into mainstream consciousness. In 1930, after several earlier hearings in prior decades by the Church of England's Lambeth Conference, the forces advancing contraception and birth control finally scored their decisive victory. This time, Anglican church leaders reversed their earlier decision and declared contraception and birth control as being morally acceptable in limited circumstances for a married couple. Once this tiny hole was punched in the dike, the birth control floodwaters would eventually sweep away the faithful in a deluge of sexual promiscuity. In response to Lambeth's caving in to birth control proponents, Pope Pius XI issued his encyclical Casti Connubii, in which he decried birth control as a moral evil and responded to Lambeth's betrayal.
Those who contracept commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious. Those who indulge in such contraceptive acts are branded with the guilt of grave sin.
Unfortunately, Pius XI's warnings were largely ignored. One group in particular was blazing the trail for contraception and birth control to be accepted, and that group was the Rockefeller family. John D. Rockefeller Sr. made his money in the oil industry, and like all of America's ruling industrialist families, the Rockefellers abided by the philosophy that limited family size was ideal for the common, ignorant masses. Much of the family's money flowed to the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, known as the American Birth Control League in the early days of the birth control movement. It was driven by personalities such as Margaret Sanger, who was aggressively opposed to church teaching.
Well, I think that the opposition is mainly from the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church.
Of the church. Well, now
hierarchy.
Of the hierarchy of the church. Now, the violation of the natural law, according you certainly can take no issue with the natural law as the hierarchy of the Catholic Church regards it.
Well, I certainly do take issue with it. I think it's untrue, and I think it's unnatural.
Well, let me ask you...
Everything bears it out that it's an unnatural attitude to take. And how do they know? I mean, after all, they're celibates. They don't know love. They don't know marriage. They know nothing about bringing up children or any of the marriage problems of life. And yet they speak to people as if they were God.
As Sanger bemoaned, with 2 world wars behind us and the Protestant faiths out of the way, the only significant opposition left to the forces of contraception, population control, and the elimination of an authentic appreciation for sexuality was the Catholic Church.
Walk like an angel, talk like an angel, but I got wise. You're the devil in disguise, oh yes you are.
In the late 1950s, the question of the legitimacy of birth control was being whispered quietly in some Catholic circles. Coinciding with the approval of the pill by the FDA in 1960, a general attitude of rebellion was also starting to bubble up. From the popularization of rock music, which preached defiance, to the increased use of drugs, to the liberation of women, the culture was experiencing major change, and that change would reshape world populations down to our present day and beyond. However, that was still largely background noise by the time Pope John XXIII gave the introductory address to the Council Fathers at Vatican II on October 11, 1962. But it would not remain so for very long. Dr. Germaine Grisey was at the heart of the explosion that rocked the church in the 1960s over the issue of birth control. Grisey is one of the very last eyewitnesses of what happened at the famous Papal Commission on Birth Control. He is also a world-renowned moral theologian in his own right. His magnum opus is the 3-volume work, The Way of the Lord Jesus, an exhaustive treatise on understanding and applying the moral teachings of the Church. He continues to write as Professor Emeritus at Mount St. Mary's University in Emmitsburg, Maryland. He was an advisor to one of the members of what is commonly referred to as the Papal Birth Control Commission. The commission was actually a series of smaller meetings with different scholars, theologians, and disciplines represented at different times and places over a period of about 3 years. The much more common picture of a bunch of guys sitting around voting to change church teaching is nothing but pure fiction. The reason we need to take a serious look at the behind-the-scenes goings-on of this birth control commission is because a final summary statement issued at the end of its work has been touted over and over again by unfaithful progressives and modernists in the church, both clergy and non-clergy, as an excuse to ignore the church's teaching on contraception. Theologians and clergy have repeatedly pointed at this summary statement and used it to say, well, even a majority of the commission thought the teaching should be changed, so obviously Pope Paul was wrong. What they do not talk about, however, is all the secret scheming and plotting that went on behind the scenes at that commission to get the desired outcome, an outcome that never materialized. Just 37 days before he died, Pope John gave the original mandate for the commission on April 27, 1963. It was in response to the larger question of population growth being discussed by an upcoming conference sponsored by the United Nations and the World Health Organization. In fact, the name of the body was the Pontifical Commission on Population, Family, and Birth Rate. Its original intent was not to talk exclusively about the birth control pill. The Commission's Secretary General, the sort of second-in-command who manages the day-to-day affairs, was a priest by the name of Henri de Riedmaten, a Dominican who was in favor of changing the Church's teaching on contraception. Over the life of the Commission, which lasted a little over 3 years, as we said, from March of 1963 until June of 1966, the one constant on the Commission was the Swiss Dominican. Dr. Grisey was personal assistant to Father John Ford, the most preeminent moral theologian in the United States at that time. Father Ford was one of the members of the commission, and unlike Father de Riedmaten, he was opposed to any change in church teaching. Dr. Grisey is also a leading supporter of the church's teaching on birth control himself, and has recently decided to make the commission documents public in a desire to quell rumors that Paul VI wrote the landmark encyclical Humanae Vitae without consultation. In his first ever TV interview, Dr. Grisey sat down with RealCatholicTV.com and talked about the commission and the attitudes of some people going into the commission.
I think everyone realized that if teaching on contraception could change, that the rest of the sexual morality the church had been teaching was going to change too.
Grisey reveals that the role of the commission was expanded by Pope Paul VI to simply study the issue of birth control and not to vote on a decision regarding church teaching. The sessions were comprised of physicians, scholars, and lay married couples, assembled to examine the question of birth control and formulate opinions for the Holy Father to consider. The key word there is opinion. The members of the commission never had any authority of any kind. Dr. Grisey also explains Paul VI's thinking behind his expansion of the commission.
He actually expanded the commission by putting together a whole group of people who were arguing for change because he wanted them to make the best argument they could. He was open to change if that were possible. He didn't see how it was possible, and he thought, well, I ought to listen to them, though, and think about what they have to say and see what kind of case they can make. So that was his approach to the thing. He was not setting up the commission with the idea that there's a decision to be made and I'm going to set up a commission to make the decision.
Grisey notes that Pope Paul delegated much responsibility to his assistants and allowed them to have a great deal of leeway in making decisions. Sadly, de Riedmaten took advantage of his great liberty to push the commission into his own preconceived conclusions on contraception. In his biography of Father John Ford, Dr. Grisey often laments that de Riedmaten was very successful in manipulating the commission. At one point, he even declares that, quote, "It was clear that de Riedmaten, the commission's Secretary General, had skillfully managed the session," end quote. One specific instance which Dr. Grisey insists played a major role in influencing the commission's outcome was when Father de Riedmaten invited philosopher and University of Notre Dame Law School instructor John T. Noonan, Jr. to speak at the opening session. Noonan was preparing to publish a book in which he argued that the Church's teaching on contraception could be changed. De Riedmatten had him present his beliefs in a 2-hour plenary meeting at the opening session.
Well, obviously that was set up to tilt the table in favor of change. De Riedmatten had organized that on purpose to have everybody kind of lined up as much as possible. I have everybody inclined to go with change. By hearing this presentation of Noonan, that was the first item that they were presented with. He was setting the table. Yeah, he was setting the table and really indicating the direction that he wanted the thing to go.
Mr. John Noonan Jr. is a very interesting figure for several reasons, but we'll talk a little bit more about him later. This, however, was only the beginning of De Riedmatten's conniving. As Dr. Grisey writes, quote, "Then instead of focusing on the question of the birth control pill or even on the truth of the Church's constant and very firm teaching, De Riedmatten focused on the question of whether, as he put it, the teaching was reformable or irreformable. 12 of the 19 members of the theological section thought that the teaching could be changed. In an effort to counteract the overwhelmingly liberal bias of the Commission's members, Father Ford asked Pope Paul to appoint Dr. Grisey to the Commission. Grisey informs us that once again, De Riedmatten placed his own goals for the Commission above the wishes of the Holy Father."
After the spring meeting of '65, he tried to get me appointed to it. And he suggested this to De Riedmatten, and nothing happened. He also, at one point, had a discussion with Paul VI in which he mentioned me and pointed out that I was helping him, but I was also a philosopher, and that there was no philosopher on the Commission who was not pro-contraception. And Paul VI gave him a handwritten note and told him, "Well, take this to De Riedmatten and have him take care of that." And Ford gave the note to De Riedmatten, but still nothing ever happened. I was never appointed.
De Riedmatten's continued manipulation of the Commission is apparent in the most important document to come out of the Commission, his Rapport Final, the report on the 4th session of the Commission. Grisey describes how shocked Father Ford and he were at the explicitly biased approach De Riedmatten took in his summary statement. Not only was the final summary statement biased, but De Riedmatten included another document, Schema Documenti, at the end of the report, implying that the schema was the summation of the Commission's work, when in fact it had been privately composed by just some of the liberal scholars who were in favor of changing the teaching on birth control. This schema was the liberals' draft of what they thought the Pope's upcoming encyclical should look like. Unfortunately, the proponents of birth control were not satisfied with trying to sway the opinion of the Holy Father. The media and some theologians were busy preparing the public to accept the idea of birth control, while Paul VI was looking to refine, as opposed to define, Catholic moral truth, as new methods of birth control were being developed. Pope Paul VI, as scholar, theologian, and Supreme Pontiff, affirmed traditional teaching in delivering Humanae Vitae.
The Birth Control Commission, as far as Paul VI was concerned, was not meant to make a decision about birth control. He didn't think of this as something that you could just decide about. He thought there is a truth here. There is what the Church has to teach is the truth about these things. And people were telling him that the teaching could be refined, it could change in some way. And he, being scholarly and serious, open-minded, thought, well, I can't just ignore what smart and good people are telling me. I've got to listen to them carefully. I've got to get their reasons for thinking this. So the commission was set up. It was expanded. It was reorganized in 1964. And the whole point of the thing, from Pope Paul's view was to get the best case that could be made. If they can make the case that this can change and I can see that that's all right, well, that's fine. But they didn't make that case, and he became convinced that he had to say what he says in Humanae Vitae.
After much angst and spilling of ink on the part of the pro-birth control advocates, they failed to make their case. When Humanae Vitae was released on July 25, 1968, reaffirming the Church's teaching, the news sent shockwaves around the world. Dr. Grisey remembers the public hostility that immediately exploded against the Pope.
In 1968, the media, the newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and so forth, had a tremendous amount of stuff on Humanae Vitae after it appeared. During the month or so after it appeared, there was a tremendous amount of content dealing with that. And almost all of it was contrary to the teaching. There was practically nothing supportive of it. Partly because what was contrary was news and what was supportive wasn't news. I mean, it was nothing new about it. But partly because largely the media were in favor of the sexual revolution, and this was a place to make the case.
One example of this rebellion, according to a Time magazine cover article from November 22, 1968, entitled "Religion, Catholic Freedom versus Authority," is the sit-in at Washington's Hilton Hotel where the U.S. Bishops' Conference was meeting. The prelates were faced with two sit-ins in the lobby where 130 priests and another night 120 laymen sat in the lobby for 2 hours singing and praying for what they called, quote, the proper use of authority in the church.
In overdeveloped countries like the United States, the main reason for the loss of faith is contraception. Why is that? Because contraception relates to the most basic issue, who is God? You see? And you find this in Catholic colleges, you find it in Catholic high schools, you find it everywhere else, that there's a mistaken idea that when we're talking about contraception, that we can simply say, well, it's your conscience. Well, you have to form your conscience, you see.
A demonstration occurred the day before the Bishops' Conference, this time at the Mayflower Hotel, also in D.C., drawing approximately 3,500 laymen. They rallied in support of 41 local priests that were disciplined by Cardinal O'Boyle for criticizing Humanae Vitae. The attitude of dissent was exacerbated by a Vatican spokesman, Monsignor Ferdinando Lambruscini, who took liberties to inform the world press that Paul VI was not speaking ex cathedra. He also implied that Humanae Vitae was not built on previous teaching, but was new, and that the Church's teaching on contraception might change in the future. Some of the first dissenters were the Canadian Catholic bishops with their infamous Winnipeg statement. In paragraph 26, they lay out for married couples a pathway of dissent from church teaching with their blessing, and falsely extend the blessing of Holy Mother Church. Listen very carefully to the following, and you can hear the voice of dissent spoken by these Canadian bishops as they create their own magisterium, their own teaching authority apart from Peter against Pope Paul VI.
The unity of the Church does not consist in a bland conformity in all ideas, but rather in a union of faith and heart, in submission to God's will, and a humble but honest and ongoing search for the truth. We stand in union with the Bishop of Rome, the successor of Peter, the sign and contributing cause of our unity with Christ and with one another. But this very union postulates such a love of the Church that we can do no less than to place all of our love and all of our intelligence at its service. If this sometimes means that in our desire to make the Church more intelligible and more beautiful we must, as pilgrims do, falter in the way or differ as to the way, no one should conclude that our common faith is lost or our loving purpose blunted.
The subtlety of their wording makes the rebellion sound almost acceptable. Listen to the heroic response of Canadian Monsignor Vincent Foy a parish priest, and the plain-speaking apologist and evangelist, American priest John Karapi.
But even so, in itself, in a sense, contraception is a greater evil, because the child that is surgically aborted is going to live forever in a state of natural happiness at least. In other words, it's not going to be condemned to hell. Whereas the contraceptive child never will be, and it should be. So it's almost satanic the way the contraception prevents millions of persons from coming into existence who should be there and will never be.
The infamous, treacherous, insidious Winnipeg Statement. A curse and a pox on the house of God. Never once has the church ever, anywhere, taught that artificial contraception and its unholy offspring, abortion, is acceptable.
Back in America, further dissidents added their voices to the chorus of heresy. One hotbed of dissent was a group of theologians from Catholic University of America, the only pontifical university in the U.S. at the time. The spokesman for this group of rebels, swelling from 87 to some 600 Catholic scholars, was Father Charles Curran, then professor of theology at Catholic University of America, and today forbidden to teach at any Catholic school. In order to more fully understand how out of step many academics really were, consider the following, taken from Walter Hill's book, From Contraception to the Abortion Explosion. In 1955, 30% of Catholic wives aged 18 to 39 admitting to using contraception. In 1970, 68% of Catholic wives aged 18 to 39 were presently using or had used contraception. In 1960, 2.3% of babies were born out of wedlock. By 1992, 22.6% of babies were born out of wedlock. By 2007, 40% of babies were born out of wedlock. As late as 1960, married families made up 74% of all households, but by the census of 2000, they accounted for just 53%. And we might add that according to the 2010 U.S. Census, that number has dropped to 48%. Think about that for a moment. In 50 years, the number of married households in the U.S. has dwindled from roughly 3/4 to less than half. Between 1960 and 2000, the number of unmarried cohabiting couples increased by 1,000%. In 2000, there were 11 million cohabiting people. The number of single mothers increased between 1970 and 2000 from 3 million to 10 million. Over the same time frame, the number of single fathers increased also from 393,000 to 2 million. In 1960, there were only 2 STDs. In 2002, there were at least 50. 54% of women having abortions used a contraceptive method during the month they became pregnant. 48% of women that are having an abortion have had at least one previous abortion. In reality, Father Charles Curran and other heterodox modernist theologians were only part of a larger movement present in Catholic higher education. These heretics were seizing an opportunity that would eventually banish church authority from Catholic campuses, allowing a self-styled magisterium to assert itself with a codex of relativism. In one word, it was betrayal. A primary source and example of betrayal to the faith is the iconic Catholic University, Notre Dame, in South Bend, Indiana, whose president, Father Theodore Hesburgh, engineered one of the greatest hijackings of a Catholic institution in history. In the early 1960s, Cass Canfield, president of Planned Parenthood in New York, saw Father John O'Brien, then head of Notre Dame's theology department, on a TV documentary and thought he might be favorable to joining up with Planned Parenthood to promote the use of contraceptives among the Catholic population. Canfield worked closely with John D. Rockefeller III, who was a huge advocate for birth control and population control. Hesburgh eventually invited Canfield and Rockefeller to bring Planned Parenthood to Notre Dame. Dr. E. Michael Jones is the respected editor of CultureWarNotes.com and Fidelity Magazine. and an expert on Notre Dame's sellout of Catholicism in the mid-20th century. He has spent a great deal of time researching the secret conferences between Rockefeller's Planned Parenthood and Hesburgh's Notre Dame.
Notre Dame sponsored the conference. They told, secret is not my word, it's their word. They said, don't let anybody know about it. We can't let the bishop know that this is happening. We will, and then the Rockefeller said, fine, that's okay with us. And in addition to that, we want you to fulfill certain conditions. And at this point, they said, we only want these people invited. We want these books put on the table. And we want, basically, it wasn't quite stated this crassly, but we want you to come to this conclusion. And Hesburgh, who won an award for defending academic freedom in 1970, was totally capitulated to every demand that the Rockefellers made.
The conferences went on from 1962 to 1965 and closely paralleled the Papal Commission on Population, Family, and Birth Rate that was going on in Rome. Now, hold on a second. Remember we told you how Father de Riedmaten had invited lawyer John Noonan Jr. to give a 2-hour presentation to the opening session of the Papal Commission? That same man was an instructor at Notre Dame's law school from 1960 to 1966, the entire period in which Rockefeller and Planned Parenthood were holding their secret conferences with specially invited theologians to determine if the church's teaching on birth control was persuasive. Let's zoom out and look at what's going on here for a minute. John Rockefeller III and Planned Parenthood are meeting at Notre Dame to promote birth control among Catholics. Noonan is teaching at Notre Dame during this same period, but at the same time, he's invited to give a 2-hour presentation to kick off the first meeting of Pope Paul's Commission on Population, Family, and Birth Rate in Rome. Father Hesburgh then not only invited the wolf into his own fold to ravage the sheep at will, but sent the wolf's emissaries into the very heart of the church. At the close of the secret conferences, the attending theologians signed a document stating they no longer believed Catholics were obligated to follow the Church's teaching on contraception. Unfortunately, this document isn't the only chapter in Notre Dame's sad saga of betrayal. The year before the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae was released, Notre Dame administrators, led by Father Hesburgh, released what was known as the Land O'Lakes Statement, in which they unfettered themselves from the chains of Catholic teaching. In releasing this statement, they aligned themselves with forces bent on the destruction of Catholicism, such as, again, the Rockefeller Foundation, with whom Father Hesburgh plotted to eradicate the authentic Catholic voice in society by indoctrinating the faithful with the world's creed. In part, the Land O'Lakes Statement was little different than the Protestant revolt of the 16th century. Here is an excerpt from the heinous text.
The Catholic University today must be a university in the full modern sense of the word, with a strong commitment to and concern for academic excellence. To perform its teaching and research functions effectively, the Catholic University must have a true autonomy and academic freedom in the face of authority of whatever kind, lay or clerical, external to the academic community itself.
This laid the groundwork for academic dissent, which would surface a year later at the Catholic University of America with specific regard to the birth control issue. But there was still more treason in the ranks, as reports which have just recently come to light reveal. One center of treachery was the Archdiocese of Boston, under the control of Richard Cardinal Cushing from 1944 until 1970. The Boston Archdiocese, you may recall, was the epicenter for the homosexual priest sex abuse crisis that would erupt into national headlines in 2002. But the seeds for perversion were already being sown some 40 years earlier by high-ranking ecclesiastics and their minions, unwilling to defend the faith against diabolical attacks. In 1963, 3 years after the FDA had approved the birth control pill, Cardinal Cushing was being interviewed on a local Boston radio program. At the time, birth control was still illegal in Massachusetts. During the interview, a woman caller asked if the church would stand in the way of legislation to make it legal. The cardinal balked and said no. The quote that got the ball rolling was, quote, "I have no right to impose my thinking, which is rooted in religious thought, on those who do not think as I do," end quote. What the public did not know is that the caller was Hazel Sagoff, Executive Director of the Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts. She had been tipped off by a confidant of the Cushings 2 weeks earlier that he had no intention of fighting for Catholic teaching on contraception in the political world. So she called in and put him on the record. For the first time, a leading, highly placed churchman had suggested that secular law should be changed to accommodate a wider variety of views. Cushing was a political strategist known for always angling, and in the heat of the 1960 U.S. presidential election with Catholic John Kennedy facing intense scrutiny for his religion, Cushing, in a pastoral letter, articulated a new view of Catholic life in America. A pluralistic democracy, a, quote, society of differing beliefs, he said, should stress what unifies its people rather than what divides. The accommodationist stance was now firmly in place and would quickly spread throughout the U.S. bishops' ranks, always talking about never giving offense, always being charitable, having to consider the beliefs of others in a pluralistic society. The Catholic world had now been properly prepared for a wholesale rejection of Catholic sexual ethics. Unsurprisingly, 5 short years after the promulgation of Humanae Vitae, abortion became legalized with the historic Roe v. Wade decision and the massaging of public opinion through various media outlets. Abortion was vital for sexually liberated individuals as a backup for now ubiquitous contraceptives and the social pressure to dehumanize life at all levels, from conception to natural death. Dr. Janet Smith, a professor of moral theology at Sacred Heart Major Seminary in the Archdiocese of Detroit, also previously taught at the University of Notre Dame before she was denied tenure for her faithful Catholic views. In quoting the abortion protection law Planned Parenthood versus Casey, she shows that most people admit that contraception and abortion do in fact go hand in hand.
Instead, what Planned Parenthood versus Casey said was, in some critical respects, abortion is of the same character as the decision to use contraception. For 2 decades of economic and social developments, people have organized intimate relationships and made choices that define their views of themselves and their places in society in reliance on the availability of abortion in the event that contraception should fail.
So the culture of death continued to advance, making sex recreational, life itself cheap, and setting future generations on a course for anywhere but heaven. Thankfully, faithful forces within the church were rallying as well. Into this world plagued by the Woodstock mentality of liberated sex, drugs, and moral relativism, entered Karol Wojtyła as Pope John Paul II, an anomaly among papal elections and a wild card on the world political stage. He made no secret of his orthodoxy with liberal church hierarchy. John Paul boldly preached the gospel of life against the culture of death. From 1979 to 1984, Pope John Paul gave a series of talks that were compiled into the book The Theology of the Body, Human Love in the Divine Plan. In this book, John Paul lays out the proper understanding of God's plan for human sexuality, explaining how people ought to think about and express their sexuality while avoiding a puritanical fear of that expression, but at the same time respecting the inherent sanctity of the conjugal union, which demands a certain modesty. During this time of the prevailing sex without consequences mentality, it becomes easy to see Pope Paul VI's prophetic words in his encyclical Humanae Vitae, warning us of the culture's obsessions and what we must do to fight these problems.
Everything, therefore, in the modern means of social communication, which arouses men's baser passions and encourages low moral standards, as well as every obscenity in the written word and every form of indecency on the stage and screen, should be condemned publicly and unanimously by all those who have at heart the advance of civilization and the safeguarding of the outstanding values of the human spirit. It is quite absurd to defend this kind of depravity in the name of art or culture, or by pleading the liberty which may be allowed in this field by the public authorities.
Because contraception is the vehicle that allows people to continue to gorge themselves on sexual deviancy, our hypersexed culture must have more and easier access to contraception. One of the foremost commentators on John Paul II's theology of the body expresses the Pope's teaching in this way, quote, "We are free, in a sense, to do whatever we want with our bodies. However, we are not free to determine whether what we do with our bodies is good or evil." He's commenting on the fact that what once was the bond of love expressed physically and resulting in the creation of new life is reduced to lust and an opportunity for pleasure alone. This is a shift from what John Paul II calls a relationship of gift to a relationship of appropriation. This appropriation is actually not a relationship at all and cripples society's authentic engagement in sexuality, marriage, and the very social structures that define the transcendent value of the human person. It would seem clear that Pope John Paul and his predecessor, particularly Paul VI, saw the destruction that would be caused by contraception and its natural partner, abortion. These ills most directly affect the family and attack its foundation, making this basic building block of God's natural law subject to reinterpretation. Contraception has had another devastating consequence many people do not think of. It leads to acceptance of homosexuality, which leads to the destruction of society. Contraception makes sex all about pleasure, not children, not families, not marriage. Because of this, the very understanding of these things has begun to change. Children are now produced in test tubes. Families are now viewed as almost any living arrangement people are willing to agree to. And marriage is being increasingly viewed and redefined as an arrangement that does not require the old constraints of man and woman any longer. Since the bottom line is pleasure, the arrangement can therefore be any arrangement that brings or promotes the personal view of pleasure. The culture has a vested interest in promoting the traditional view of marriage because it is all about continuing into the next generation, the propagation of the race. Marriage is not primarily about pleasure from the sexual union. It has a very public aspect to it as well as the private. Because of this, it must be protected. But the contraceptive mentality throws that understanding overboard and declares it's all about me. I'll have sex with whoever I want, under whatever circumstances I want, and the state will enshrine my choice in law. This is the short course to disaster for civilization. Dr. Philip Sutton is a professor and clinical psychologist serving patients in the state of Michigan. He has some poignant insights into the current breakdown of the family.
Is that children do best when raised in their own home by their married mother and father. Any culture in history that has somehow failed to honor and support in laws, but as well as in the everyday customs, mother-father-headed families and children being raised by their own biological parents, it's all kinds of trouble.
In recent decades, contraception has provided the impetus for a radical redefinition of the institution of the family. Now that the primary focus of sex is pleasure, cultural liberals insist that any type of sexual behavior which brings pleasure is not only acceptable, but a moral good in and of itself and is worthy of having a legally protected relationship formed around it. This is the essence of the bond that homosexual activists want, for example, forming civil unions that can be branded with the name marriage, and in so doing, destroy the traditional definition of marriage between one man and one woman. Children are also an obvious casualty of the contraceptive mentality because simply they are not born. The creative love of God is denied, preventing more souls from being born and joining the ranks of the saints in heaven.
As Benedict XVI said at the beginning of his pontificate, he said, each of us is the product of a thought of God. So each individual human soul is the result of a distinct act of creation by God. And because there's no time in eternity, that soul was intended from forever, for always, all right? Because God always existed, all right? So the contracepting couple, what they say, in effect to God, is something like this. They say, Look, God, for all we know, it may be your will that from this act of ours, a new human being will come into existence who will live forever. For all we know, that may be your will, and we won't let you do it.
The radical ideas born from a contraceptive mentality that have given rise to perverted and childless unions have not actually redefined marriage and family so much as they have destroyed the institution of marriage and family, so that now, to a large extent, the family unit simply does not exist at all. Pope Paul VI admonishes his flock to always practice responsible parenthood, and he's not referring to the pill.
In a word, the exercise of responsible parenthood requires that husband and wife, keeping a right order of priorities, recognize their own duties towards God, themselves, their families, and human society. They are bound to ensure that what they do corresponds to the will of God the Creator.
When people ignore the responsibilities of parenthood and use contraception, relationships are distorted. If sex is only an expression of pleasure and marriage is not primarily for procreation, then any relationship is allowable because pleasure is its only measure. We no longer see sex in a truly natural way, but have made it only a physical act whose goal is pleasure, separating its life-giving end, the procreation of children. Again, we turn to Paul VI and Humanae Vitae.
Another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman and, disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as a partner whom he should surround with care and affection.
Once contraception eliminates consequences from sexual behavior, the only guideline left is pleasure. If it feels good, it is good. Here is a rather frank assessment of an unpleasant topic.
Then once that happens, every sexual act that allows that sort of thing, that allows you to detach from the procreation of children or to deny the procreation of children and collapses into pleasure, all you're doing there is mutually masturbating.
If contraception is nothing more than mutual masturbation, and masturbation leads to many of our social ills, then it's clear that contraception is the cause of those same social ills. Because procreation has successfully been separated from sex, which is now defined only as pleasure, then there is no logical basis to say that people shouldn't engage in sterile homosexual sex, or to complain about organizations like the National Man-Boy Love Association, or polyamory, or even bestiality. In the 50 years since the promulgation of the Humanae Vitae encyclical, most of our clergy, most especially the very bishops themselves, have been nearly totally silent on the matter of contraception and the resounding effect it has had on every level of society. Every day, their flocks, whose souls they are accountable to Almighty God for, are besieged from every side in 100 ways by a culture pushing the contraceptive mentality with all its evil, and they stand mute. Their silence on this must end, and it must end immediately. In the end, we must be responsible for our actions and look to the authentic church teaching as revealed over the last 2,000 years and make a commitment to walk with Christ. Contraception is the cause of enormous amounts of misery and human suffering, and sometimes becomes a part of people's lives when they are seeming to obey the teachings of the church. Natural family planning, NFP, as allowed by Holy Mother Church, can sometimes be misused and become a kind of Catholic contraception when grave reasons are not present. The trusted publication, the Homiletic and Pastoral Review, printed the article, The Primacy of Charity, in the December 2010 issue, which speaks to this problem.
When used in circumstances that are not defensively serious in comparison to the primary end of the great vocation of marriage in the Church, NFP is abused and can thereby turn sinful, even mortally so, for the couple. a newly married couple who want to enjoy each other's bodily comfort for some time prior to shouldering the burden of children, or spouses postponing children because both wish to pursue doctorates simultaneously, would be examples of what the poet Cowper calls pampered appetite obscene, because in neither case is the intention honorable when weighed against the serious obligations of the state of life that has been entered into.
In the end, by refusing to use contraception and accepting life freely, we are keeping our eyes on the goal that is heaven, purchased for us by our Lord on the cross and won for us by His resurrection. And though many of our pastors are silent or worse, telling us that we may use contraception, we must demand authentic Catholic teaching, embrace our cross, and frequent Mass and the sacraments, through which we share in God's eternal life. Here's what it all comes down to for Dr. Germain Grisey.
But all the moral issues around are really secondary. The primary question that we need to be concerned about is entering into the kingdom and the hope we have. What's in store for us? Eye has not seen, ear has not heard. It hasn't entered the heart of man what God has prepared for those who love Him. We have to be concerned about what really is in store for us and for other people. And it's the kingdom and being part of that kingdom, rising from the dead, being with our loved ones, being in a wonderful new world. That's what's in store. That's our hope. That's what we live for. And living for that, it's worthwhile to be a Christian. It's worthwhile to take up your cross, carry it day by day, and not to try to put it aside. Not to try to put it aside. Never put your cross down, because the kingdom is there at the end of the path.
To sum up, the evil of contraception has so penetrated the church and the lives of so many Catholics because of deceit and betrayal, outright treason against God Himself on the part of cardinals, bishops, theologians, priests, and various lay leaders. They have either promoted the evil directly or kept silent in the face of it. In the end, it makes no difference. They have fanned and allowed the fires of hell itself to leap up and engulf the very souls they are committed to teach, govern, and sanctify. They have not lifted a finger to protect the souls owing to their own lusts or perversions or cowardice. Today, the rot and evil in the body of Christ of divorce and remarriage, destroyed families, abortions, single-parent children, and all the resulting emotional and psychological extensions of homosexuality, fear of commitment, fornication, premarital sex, sexually transmitted disease, and on, the dissolution of the very society itself has come back on the very leaders who have refused to follow and teach the hard teachings of our blessed Lord. Their actions have instituted a mass apostasy never before seen in the annals of 2,000 years. They have caused by their silence and obstinate refusal to preach the truth the almost total collapse of the faith in country after country after country. Today, they must now face the consequences of their collaboration with Lucifer. They must close down parishes by the hundreds, shutter Catholic schools, preside over the steepest decline in the faith in the history of the Catholic world. This is the contraception deception. Catholics have been deceived by their leaders who have cared more for their own bodies and lusts of the flesh and power than the bodies and souls of their flock.
I'll tell you why they're so authentic, because of the failure of the teaching church, the bishops and the local churches, to teach the truth on the transmission of life.
The magisterium of the Church has taught and retaught the truths of conjugal love throughout the centuries, and in so doing is merely echoing the teachings of Christ, who gave us our sexuality so that we could participate in His salvific love here on earth and find ultimate love and union with Him in heaven. Catholics must both talk the talk and walk the walk in regard to sexual morality, because that is the reality of our faith. So now you know. Thanks for watching this edition of CIA, Catholic Investigative Agency. I'm Michael Voris. Let's hit the streets.